I analyzed 15 years of fantasy data to find out what you should expect from this year's bumper wide receiver class in their rookie seasons. I'll break down the data and find out whether you can justify taking Marvin Harrison Jr. as a top 10 receiver in your drafts. Plus, I'll take you through my updated redraft wide receiver rankings on the Fantasy First Down. Can you feel it? That's right. We're only 2 weeks away from the NFL season, and the excitement is definitely palpable. I hope you've done well in your drafts so far. And if you've got drafts coming up, I hope tonight's video really helps you out. If you haven't already, make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can check out all my latest rankings on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. You can check us out on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Plus, all of my updated rankings are also at ffdfantasyfootball.com. Recommend you getting that up before your latest draft. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com, and I'll also be doing a live video with those guys as well within the next 24 hours or so. Tonight, we are talking about wide receivers, and specifically, we're talking about all the rookies in this year's class. It's really difficult to value rookies relative to anyone else, and so these are the biggest players you need to make decisions on going into this year's draft. And to me, this is one of the strongest wide receiver classes we've ever had. So this is going to be the year where you should be taking shots on these guys. If you don't have a lot of shares in these rookie wide receivers, you're going to be disappointed, but you have to pick the right one. So let's get into looking at how these players have gone in the past. And we're once again breaking them down based on draft spot. If you haven't already, you can always go back and check out my quarterback and running back versions of these videos. I think it will help you out in valuing those players as well. But wide receivers is where it's at, and this is going to be a big part of your draft strategy. If you haven't seen it before, basically I've gone through and looked at their draft position and then looked at their fantasy finish in PPR in their first fantasy season when they were rookies. For some of them, they kind of got good later on in the year. So if they didn't play over 70% snaps until later in the season, I also looked at what their fantasy finish would be just for that period of time after they first became a starter, which is to say over 70% snaps. And you can see with former top 10 players, the success rate is pretty darn good. Having said that, there have been plenty of busts that are enough to put people off these players. But if you look at when they happened, they were all before 2017. If you look at those red boxes, there's not a single red box since 2017. All of the recent top 10 rookie wide receivers have been fantastic. Jamar Chase really broke the mold with that top 5 season a couple of years ago. Jalen Waddle was really good in the previous year. And we've seen other players even more recently, in Garrett Wilson, for example, have good years as well. Drake London's really the only recent bust, and even he went into a really difficult situation. So it is feasible to say Marvin Harrison Jr. could replicate that Jamar Chase style year. But there have been plenty of amazing rookies that come out and not manage to do that. AJ Green was an excellent prospect when he came out. So was Julio Jones. Calvin Johnson, of course, was spectacular. Marvin Harrison Jr. fits in that same category, but most of those guys didn't get into the top 10. And that's where Marvin Harrison Jr. is being drafted at the moment. So I do feel like top 10's right on the edge of reasonable for him. There are plenty of situations where I wouldn't want to be taking him that high. And even though there's no one I can really justify putting ahead of him, I do think if you take him top 10, you're probably going to find that most of the time he's not going to pay off as a top 10 option. I do think getting Malik Neighbors a lot later as more of a wide receiver 20 is a lot more feasible, because there's a lot of players on this list that went into weak offenses with weak quarterbacks and still managed to pay off as top 20 wide receivers. And I do think we could see that happening with Malik Neighbors. So it does make sense to be taking Malik Neighbors at his current cost. And of those two, he's my preferred option. Rome Odunze is kind of the one that no one's really talking about at the moment. He's not expected to play in 12 personnel groupings, and that's really going to affect his snap share and hence the output he's going to be able to put out on a weekly basis. It's going to make him significantly more variable, and that's not what you want from your redraft wide receivers. For that reason, he's more of a dynasty guy for me. I really do like him in dynasty. The talent is there, but it's going to be very difficult for him to go past DJ Moore or Keenan Allen. And he's also got a rookie throwing in the ball in Caleb Williams. So I think he's significantly more likely to have one of these low-end starts to his career. More of like a wide receiver 30 to 40 range would, I think, be more reasonable for what we should expect from Rome Odunze. Now, behind then, we had later in the first round, Brian Thomas Jr. went first, and then a bit of a gap before Xavier Worthy, Ricky Pearsall, and Xavier Liggett. Now, to be fair, these guys go into very different situations. And you can see on this chart, we've got a great variety in outcomes as well. Of course, Justin Jefferson's the big name. He had that big top 10 finish. We also saw CeeDee Lamb was pretty impressive in his first year, though realistically only finished as the wide receiver 20. Calvin Ridley had a good season. But most of these guys did struggle. It really wasn't until last year that we saw another bout of these guys doing a good job. Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison, of course, had good seasons, even though the guys drafted before him in Quentin Johnston and Jackson Smith-Njigba couldn't get it done. So what do we expect from these guys? I think Brian Thomas probably goes into one of those starting roles. And I do think if you look at these guys who kind of went out and from week one were starting, you're talking about guys like CeeDee Lamb, you're talking about Zay Flowers. They're the main names there. Will Fuller, of course, started week one as well, and so did Nelson Aguilar. So there is a little bit of variety there, but I do feel like Brian Thomas Jr. belongs ahead of those guys. I don't think it's unreasonable to expect a top 25 finish out of Brian Thomas Jr. I do think that's definitely within the range of possibilities, given we've seen him playing every snap, whereas Christian Kirk's been sitting out in the preseason. And that's kind of good sign for Brian Thomas Jr. and his chances of really paying off this year. Xavier Worthy's in that same situation. The Chiefs have shown they really like him with the way they've used him in the preseason. Marquise Brown being injured kind of gives him a soft start as well. So he should have a good opportunity to pay off where he's being drafted well below where I think his output could potentially be. Having said that, you look at this list, there's a lot of guys that busted, and you do have to understand that there is significant risk in drafting any of these guys. Having said that, if someone's going to bust, it's probably going to be Ricky Pearsall or Xavier Liggett. I think those are the two guys that are going to really struggle. Pearsall, of course, goes into an awkward situation where he's not really healthy yet. We don't know what's happening with Brandon Ayuk. Juwan Jennings is still hanging around. It's entirely possible that even if he starts week one, he might lose that job again later on, or alternatively, he's only going to be starting when either Debo or Brandon Ayuk is out, depending on whether Ayuk ends up staying with the 49ers. So Pearsall goes into an awkward situation where I'm mostly avoiding him in redraft. He's also got to compete, of course, with George Kittle and Christian McCaffrey, and that makes his life a lot harder. There's a lot of guys who've gone into those situations and struggled, and I feel like he could be added to that list. Xavier Liggett's a guy I really like, but ultimately there are some questions on whether he's even going to be starting week one. We saw Jonathan Mingo, of course, struggle to get a starting job last year, but he's been looking better than Liggett in training camp, and he's been playing ahead of him in preseason games. They've still got Adam Thielen there. They've signed Deontay Johnson. I'm just not sure that there's space for the rookie, and for that reason, I'm a little bit wary of taking him in redraft. He's a guy I'm mainly going to be avoiding because he looks like another real candidate to bust. Both of those guys are going into situations where I feel like their upside is a Jackson Smith-Njigba situation, and their downside is just not even playing and being a bench guy. Now, we saw 3 wide receivers in the first few day 2 picks, and they're all talented players. I think Keon Coleman goes into an excellent situation. Ladd McConkey also could be the number 1 receiver for the Chargers for what that's worth, and it might not be a lot. And I think we expected Jalen Pogg to do more, but there have been a lot of reports that he's not even going to be starting. If you watch my recent breakdown of preseason week 2 games, you'll note that he was playing behind Tyquan Thornton, as well as playing behind, of course, the injured Kendrick Bourne, playing behind Pop Douglas, who's mainly in the slot, and even playing behind KJ Osborne, who will probably continue to start for him even once Bourne is back. So it's an ugly situation for Polk. He's going to have to earn a starting spot. That might not come till later in the season. For Keon Coleman, on the other hand, I think he's a guy who could potentially be one of the blue boxes that appears in this graphic here. Most of these boxes are red, or at least on the low side. There's not many guys who had big boom seasons, but I feel like he could have a Michael Thomas style breakout. I feel like there's real upside there for Coleman in a high-powered offense. He's going into the Stephon Diggs role. We've seen the snap share he's been getting. It's been guys like Khalil Shakir and Curtis Samuel coming off in 12 personnel, and it's been Coleman playing with Mac Hollins, with Hollins even coming off more than Coleman is. Coleman's essentially a 100% snap player at the moment. He is their main outside receiver. I feel like he could be excellent this season. So for that reason, I have Coleman pretty high. He's even stuck into my top 30 in my redraft rankings. Ladd McConkey is a little bit lower. I feel like he goes into more of a awkward situation where the offense isn't going to be powerful enough, but he's clearly the starter. And I do think it is reasonable to suggest he could be a wide receiver 3. We have seen guys do that in this range, but I don't think he has the upside to have a Michael Thomas or T. Higgins style season. I feel like we can expect something a little bit closer to a Sterling Shepard, where he's the number one guy in a weaker offense. And I feel like that we could see him follow that similar path. Later in that round, of course, we saw Adonai Mitchell drafted. We have seen some good players drafted in this range. A.J. Brown was the big name for years. DK Metcalf was obviously a familiar one. Chase Claypool had that great rookie season before falling away. But gosh, there's a lot of busts here. There's a lot of guys that you would just not see on fantasy teams anyway for a long time. In fact, realistically, probably only 3 out of 20 players had success from this range until last year. And all of a sudden we saw Jaden Reed come along and have that really hot end to the season. And Rashee Rice as well, who wasn't even playing over 70% snaps until week 13, and he still managed a wide receiver 2 season. So we have seen that guys drafted in this range more recently have had success. And there's hope for Adonai Mitchell for that reason, especially when Josh Downs is injured and he's going to be forced into a starting role. I think there were questions on whether he was going to be playing against Alec Pierce or not. It now seems like that will likely be the case. And he will be playing from the slot, and we know that can be really productive. We still have question marks over how Anthony Richardson's going to go. So there's certainly some risk here, and there's some talented players in this range who ultimately got it right later on but struggled in their rookie season. I'm looking at you, George Pickens, and I feel like Adonai Mitchell falls into that same category of maybe having a quiet first season before getting it together later on. So he's someone I'm wary of. I've dropped him down a little bit, but he's still someone that I want on my bench for his upside. Now, round 3 has been a real dead spot. We did see Tank Dell and Josh Downs last year, and that can give you a little bit of excitement. But there's a lot of red on this list. And even last year, you still had Jalen Hyatt, who a lot of people liked. Still had Cedric Tillman. You still had Michael Wilson. You still had Trey Tucker. These were all guys drafted in the 3rd round last season. I don't know that you can trust most of these guys at all. Malaki Corley doesn't look like he's going to get a starting role. Jermaine Burton's clearly behind Andre Yosevas. Roman Wilson's not getting a starting role. Jalen McMillan's fighting with Trey Palmer to be the 3rd guy in Tampa. Luke McCaffrey's way down, even though they've traded away Jahan Dodson. It does look like McCaffrey's going to be down there. I think we're going to see a whole lot more red added to this list. There are no Cooper Kupps or Terry McLaurins on this list. It's not even Deontay Johnson. Josh Downs is probably the upside there. You could see someone like a McMillan just happen to burst out in the season. The other guys are really going to need injuries ahead of them. I don't want any of these guys for redraft. Now, on day 3, there were a heap of names, and there's some fantasy darlings there. Troy Franklin has been very popular in Dynasty, as has Javon Baker. I was not interested in either of those guys. I had him ranked way lower than everyone else, and I feel very justified by that now. Having said that, I was very low on Puka Nacua last year. My colleague Kiwi, who of course gets involved in the channel sometimes, was very, 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 very high on him. For what it's worth, he's also high on Tyrone Tracy this season. And he was, of course, right in this situation. Nacua was very much the outlier. We've seen him. We've seen Amon-Ra St. Brown. We saw a little bit of Darius Slayton later on in his rookie season. Darnell Mooney had an okay season. And then a whole lot of red. Now, you might think, well, that's a whole lot of red. But there's still a couple of guys who've had good seasons. These are only the guys who finished in the top 100 at some stage during the season. There were 93 day 3 picks over the 7-odd seasons that I looked at. The success rate here is extremely low. The chances are that none of these guys will even be a top 50 player. In fact, I think that's probably the most likely outcome. There are some names that have been very popular. People have been pestering me about Jordan Whittington. That's not happening. People have been pestering me about Brendan Rice. Well, he did technically start the last game ahead of Quinton Johnston and ahead of DJ Chark, but I still don't think he's someone I want in fantasy, especially not redraft fantasy. The reality is there's just no players here who are in a good position to succeed. Devontae Walker was another that we had hoped for. He's playing as the wide receiver 6 or 7. It's really, really, really ugly. I do think there's guys that are going to make rosters from day 3, and 1 or 2 might burst forward, but we're talking about a pool of about 15 to 20 players. Your odds of selecting the right one is really low. Don't bother with day 3 players in redraft. It's just plain not worth it. Let's have a look at what impact this has made to my wide receiver rankings as you go into your fantasy drafts this weekend or next. And there's not much change at the top for me. I've still got CeeDee Lamb on the top. He has moved towards Tyreek Hill, but I do have faith that he is going to play in week one. Tyreek Hill, of course, signed a new contract rejig, I guess you'd say. He's going to be a great weapon this season as well. If you are nervous about Lamb, I think it's totally reasonable to take Hill. I've got them very close to each other. And this is half PPR, by the way. In PPR, Lamb is a little bit higher for me, but ultimately, I think Tyreek's a fantastic option as well. You can take either of those guys and be perfectly happy about it. In a lot of leagues, they should be going second and third pick. Justin Jefferson's an interesting one. I recently got him as late as the ninth pick, which seems absolutely crazy to me. There are a lot of people nervous about the fact that JJ McCarthy's injured. That makes no sense to me because Sam Darnold was always going to start anyway. And I feel like Sam Darnold's better for Justin Jefferson than JJ McCarthy would have been. So I still like Justin Jefferson. He's the JJ that I want in my team. Amon-Ra and Brown's close behind him. And in PPR, I think you could argue taking him over Jefferson. Jamar Chase has been a popular name. I don't really see it. It wasn't great last season. He's my wide receiver 5, but there's a big gulf between those top 4 in Chase. AJ Brown comes in just after him, and I think he's another solid late first-round option. And then I've got another gap to Garrett Wilson, who I'm a bit nervous about, but I do think he should be better with Aaron Rodgers. Puka Nacua as well, I'm a bit nervous about because Cooper Kupp comes back, but I still think he's going to be good. And then I have another big gap to where I have Mike Evans. And this does seem pretty high for Mike Evans, and admittedly in PPR, I'm a little bit lower on him. But we're talking about a guy who's been a top 12 fantasy finisher in the last, 5 seasons. He was the wide receiver 7 last season. He's fantastically consistent. There's so few other options. It's him, Chris Godwin, and Rashad White, and that's all they have. So I do really like Mike Evans this year. He slides in ahead of Marvin Harrison Jr., who I don't like putting there, but I just don't feel like there's anyone else that can really obviously go ahead of him. There's only one guy that I've tossed up putting ahead of him, and that's Devontae Adams. And I potentially would have put him ahead of him in PPR, but in half PPR, I just feel like we might find that Marvin Harrison Jr. is more capable of those big plays, even though Adams finds a lot of touchdowns. Gardner Minshew can be aggressive enough to make that work. Those two are very close for me. I think they could go either way. Drake London's a real projection. I feel like if you reach for him, you're going to get in trouble. And I think reasonably, it's entirely reasonable to say, I don't quite want to take him this high. Deebo Samuel, I think, could be particularly good, especially with the question marks over Ayuk. If Brendan Ayuk signs and it's very clear he's going to play for San Fran, he'll jump up and he might end up ahead of Samuel and ahead of London. But right now, that risk of him going to Pittsburgh or sitting out is enough for me to worry. It's mainly the Pittsburgh thing that's a worry. I don't know that sitting out's likely, but I'm still nervous about him, and that's why he's a little bit lower. Chris Olave is going to be the clear number 1 weapon there, but it's hard to feel fantastic about him in that offense. Amari Cooper, I think, could be very, very good. I'm going to talk about him on the Razzball show this weekend as well. I do think that he is one of my favorite mid-round options. You can get him in round 5 and 6. It's absolutely crazy. He's going as like the wide receiver 20-odd, and he was the wide receiver, 13 last year, maybe even higher than that. It's just absolutely insane. Oh, and he missed 2 games, and he was a wide receiver 13. Realistically, on a per-game basis, he was well inside the top 10. And he did that with 5 quarterbacks. He had Deshaun Watson, he had Joe Flacco, he had Dorian Robinson-Thompson, he had Jeff Driscoll, who's a converted tight end. Well, he's actually a quarterback who converted to a tight end, then converted back. And PJ Walker, who's just a backup's backup, basically. And yet Amari Cooper still had that level of success. He had very, very, very good. And realistically, I would happily take him earlier than this as well. And then there's a bit of a gap down to DJ Moore, Nico Collins, some guys that are the top guys in high-powered offenses potentially, but they do have a lot of target competition. DK Metcalf kind of falls into that category, but there's a lot of buzz. He's going to be the main guy this year. And then there's another rookie, Malik Neighbors, who I talked about earlier. I think in PPR, I'd put him even higher. I do think he's going to struggle a bit in half PPR, but he's so explosive that he's got to be effective this year. He does have more bus capacity than most of the guys around him. I think Nico Collins is a bit of a risk too. But I do really like the upside of Neighbors. Michael Pittman is a big question mark with Anthony Richardson, but I do feel he'll be good. George Pickens, another one of those guys, the top player in a poor offense. Cooper Kupp, I think, has upside in PPR. I'd certainly have him a couple of spots higher. And then you have all these wide receiver twos. You have Jalen Waddles, you have Devonta Smiths, you have your T. Higgins. I think I'm probably a little bit too low on T. Higgins. I feel like he could go higher, but these guys kind of just all bundle into one group for me. And I think they're all viable, like low-end wide receiver 2 options. And it's really hard to order them in any particular order. Zay Flowers and Rashee Rice is kind of like the top guys in their offenses, but They're not really, because they've both got excellent tight ends ahead of them. Obviously, Rice has the better quarterback, but there is a lot more target competition. Stephon Diggs have moved up slightly because of his usage in the preseason. He's clearly playing ahead of Tank Dell in 12 personnel. And there's another rookie, Keon Coleman, a guy I really like in Buffalo. I think he's going to be fantastic this season. Really big upside, and you can get him pretty cheap as well. You don't need to take him as the wide receiver 30. He's going later in a lot of drafts. There's a couple of Jacksonville guys. Christian Kirk has been losing some 12 personnel snaps. That makes me really nervous. Having said that, Jaden Reed didn't get them last season, and he was fantastic down the stretch last season. So it is entirely possible that they'll keep that consistency going. Reed's a risk for that reason, but it is possible he starts to get all the snaps again, and that would really help him. Chris Godwin's moving to the slot. I really like that for him. I think that offers him a lot of upside. Terry McLaurin's going way too early for me. I would not touch him. I know this is half PPR, and PPR is even lower. I don't like that situation. They got nobody else, but they're not going to need to throw the ball a lot, and they're certainly not going to attack downfield in a lot of the games. They had Sam Howell, who had the highest pass rate last season, and Terry McLaurin didn't manage to be effective. What makes you think he's going to magically be effective now? Deontay Johnson is going to get a lot of targets. I think in PPR he goes higher than this. Tank Dell, I think he's going to be hurt by the target competition, but he's a talented player, and I still think he could be good. Keenan Allen, again, target competition. I love Keenan Allen so much. So disappointing that he's in that offense where it's so crowded. And then it's Christian Watson, who I think has massive upside, probably more upside than anyone else on this page. He actually just needs to make it happen. And Xavier Worthy, another rookie. I seem to have the rookies down in the bottom of all these lists. It was Neighbors at 20, Coleman at 30, and then Worthy at 40. Just a coincidence. Worthy could be very good this season. There's definitely upside, but we have seen that this success rate of guys in this range, it's a little bit rocky, so there's definitely some risk there. And then right behind him, another rookie in Ladd McConkey. In PPI is a little bit higher than this, but realistically, it's hard to see the Chargers passing the ball enough and having a consistent enough offense for him to be someone they rely on. I think that's going to be a really awkward situation. DeAndre Hopkins is injured, but I do expect he'll be back soon. For that reason, he's still in that 42 spot. Cortland Sutton with the awful Denver Broncos. I think they're going to really struggle. Bo Nix is not bad. He's definitely pro ready, but I wouldn't want his wide receivers. Then it's Jamison Williams, who I think could be explosive and have a breakout season. Calvin Ridley goes into that awkward situation at Tennessee where they got Will Levis. I don't like that at all. Jacoby Myers has kind of been playing in and out of the slot. He was in the slot in week 1, then slid out of the slot in week 2. Hard to know how they're going to use him, but if they use him in the slot, he could be very productive. Tyler Lockett, I mean, he's been so good for so long. He doesn't seem to be losing snaps to Jackson Smith and Najee. I still think he's the wide receiver too. I think he could be a little bit of a bargain there, especially if you're weak at wide receiver and just need someone who can start. Or if you're in a deep league where you're starting a lot of flex positions, I think Lockett's a cheap way to fill one of those and get good production. I did it in a lot of leagues last year. It was really effective. Jordan Addison, of course, has a lot of question marks over him. I think we probably don't see a suspension this year, but I think we probably see that offense isn't high-powered enough to really have two really good wide receivers. I think Jefferson's the main guy, and Addison's just kind of going to be his deputy. Joshua Palmer is, I guess, the nominal number one receiver for the Chargers, but it's really McConkey. Look, Palmer's not going to get enough of the ball the way he needs to be really effective. And finally, Jahan Dotson. I am very much aware of the news of his move to Philly, but I made this graphic last night, and I didn't want to change it because I still wanted to talk about this. He dropped out of my top 50. I don't like the situation of him going to Philly. I don't think they can have 3 functional high-ranking wide receivers. I feel like he needs an injury ahead of him to be useful. It's really disappointing. I do think there are situations where he could have been effective. We're talking about top 16 first-round pick from a couple of seasons ago. There's the talent there. He just needs to make it work. I don't know that Philly's the place with Jalen Hurts to have another wide receiver on top of your excellent running back and on top of your strong tight ends as well. It's just an awkward situation. He'll drop out for me. Finally, you got drafts coming up. You're running out of time to take up my special offer for personalized rankings. I made 11 sets of these rankings in the last 48 hours. I'm on a roll. I would like to help you in your league. Very simple. You send me your league settings. You send me $10. I will give you some rankings that are especially for your league, specifically catered in a list so that you know who to draft based on your league settings. They're going to be so much more accurate because they're specifically for your league. So hit me up, benwasley23@gmail.com, or you can check us out on Instagram as well. Happy to help you out there as well. And that's all we've got for tonight. Good luck with your leagues in the current weekend. If you haven't already, it'd be awesome if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. Our website is ffdfantasyfootball.com. I recommend having that open during your drafts. And of course, my articles. I've got a new one coming out on this wide receiver topic. I just had a slightly different take in the article at football.rasball.com. I look forward to seeing you guys in a couple of days' time for the next video when I break down all the latest news during the preseason. I will see you then.